I think we're ready to introduce our very first speaker of the morning, and I had the delight, I think, of meeting Lord Peter Hain face to face, because I've interviewed him on the radio. I've read his latest book on Madiba, and he's somebody who certainly keeps his finger on the pulse of what's happening in South Africa. He is a UK MP and a cabinet minister in the House of Lords. He's more readily known, I think, to us in South Africa as a tireless anti-apartheid campaigner, very vocal about some of the issues that still blight us here in South Africa, talking about corruption in our SOEs, and bringing the attention of these problems here in South Africa to that of the British political school, so to speak. I think last night, if I'm right, Lord Hain, we had a lot of fun, and there were a lot of sage perspectives that you shared with those who were in the room. And because I bought him dinner last night, I have earned, I think, the right to call you the boy from Pretoria. Because if you attended Pretoria Boys High School, you have a fellow alumnus in Lord Hain. Any Pretoria Boys High people here? Okay, you're the only one that stood out, and you were so excellent and made it into this forum. So I would love to welcome you to the stage, Lord Peter Hain. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. It's all yours.
Thank you, Iman. And thank you to Neil Gopal, your CEO of SAPOA, for inviting me. When he contacted me to be with you this morning, I was a bit surprised because a newspaper columnist, when I was in the cabinet in Britain, described me as the second most boring member of the cabinet. I said, "Why do you want me to speak to you here this morning, Neil?" So he took a chance. Yesterday I flew in from Britain. Chaotic, Brexit gridlocked, rainy Britain. What a relief to be in tranquil, stable, sunny South Africa. And I'm continuously asked by people whenever I come back here, what's going to happen? And my answer is this: I've been in politics for 50 years, holding some of the most senior jobs in the British cabinet. I used to pride myself on knowing what was going on, and my answer is, I haven't a clue. And nobody else does, except my view is it's going to get worse. And it's got worse for the last 9 months in Britain, and it's going to continue doing so. I was brought up in South Africa, and then I went through no choice of my own into exile in Britain in 1966 as a teenager, where I started stopping Springbok tours, described here as the Hain the Pain. And one newspaper editor said this: "It would be a mercy for humanity if this unpleasant little creep were to fall into a sewage tank up to his neck head first." So I wasn't the most respected and supported person in those days. And when I, a little while ago, used parliamentary privilege in the House of Lords to expose corruption here under President Zuma and the Gupta brothers, I got all sorts of emails from white South Africans congratulating me, but adding at the end of the email, "But I hated what you did to the Springboks." And I sent a reply back saying, "Thank you very much, but the values that propelled me to interrupt whites-only sports teams from South Africa in the battle against apartheid are the same values that encouraged me to support those fighting corruption here in South Africa." And as we meet here in Cape Town, in the premier picturesque resort of Auli, situated in the Himalayas, two sons of the Gupta brothers are getting married in what the Times of India reports is a big splash wedding ceremony with a bevy of industrialists, politicians, and Bollywood celebrities being ferried in by chartered helicopters from Delhi and Mumbai, costing as much as 100 million rand, looted from Eskom, Transnet, SAA, SARS, and so on. The international financial system is culpable, and the international financial system must now track that money down and repay it to the South African Treasury. And it's been very painful, not just for those of you in the business sector doing your best to build the country and make a return, but also for veterans of the freedom struggle, including my parents. Those people did not sacrifice so much to have their legacy looted, and together, all of us in this conference and the whole of the country have got to reclaim the Mandela values of integrity, good governance, social justice, equality, and democracy. And no global corporate should have anything to do with corruption, whitewashing corruption, or getting fat fees from looters, because it takes two to tango in the corruption business. And the significance of this for global corporates, and this is one of the main things I want to stress in what I say this morning, is it was all right for them to take part in this corruption business under President Zuma and the Gupta brothers when it was confined to domestic media and domestic politics here in South Africa. They seem to be continuously getting away with it. But when it went global, that's when they got damaged. When I named Bell Pottinger and asked the government to take action against them for their vile racist campaign on behalf of the Zumarites and the Guptarites, when I raised it in Parliament, they went bankrupt the week later. In November, I wrote and exposed and I contacted the finance ministry in Britain to take action to stop the systematic transnational financial crime network facilitated by the Guptas and the Zumas, mentioning the Estina Frieda dairy farm project. You remember that? Perhaps the most shamelessly blatant example of robbing the poor to feed obscene luxury. And soon, The Economist was running a front-page feature on that. The New York Times was covering it. The Financial Times was covering it. And then I named British institutions like HSBC, Standard Chartered, the Bank of Baroda, and others who were facilitating, acting as conduits for the massive laundering of billions of rand, mainly through Dubai and Hong Kong. And they all came to see me in my office in the House of Lords. Now, why did they do that? Why did the international media report that for the first time? Why were they suddenly feeling the heat, these global corporates? Because their activities here in conniving with corruption had gone global. And the same thing happened to KPMG and McKinsey and also to the international law firm Hogan Lovells. Because the lesson is this, that in today's world of scrutiny and transparency, you simply cannot afford to be associated with state capture or corruption, or else you risk running massive reputational damage and lost business, which damages your own bottom line. And we've seen that with KPMG losing billions of contracts. We've seen it with McKinsey, the same. We saw it, of course, with Bell Pottinger, and I thought that was a very interesting example. Here was a public affairs agency whose mission was to manage the reputation of their clients. The one organization they forgot about the reputation of was their own. And so the message of all of this is that there needs to be a war on corruption in South Africa, which I think the president is trying to lead, and he has my support, and I hope yours. A war against organized crime, financial crime, and tax evasion, with the international business and financial community supporting and cooperating with the South African Revenue Service and the Treasury, maybe with a business community here and internationally also helping that task with top legal, accounting, investigative, and intelligence capabilities. It can't just be business as usual any more than it could be government as usual as it was in those disastrous Zuma years. We've got to work together, supporting the president and helping him in his tough job of rescuing the government, rescuing public administration, and rescuing the economy and the whole of the country from this mire. And we need to have cooperation internationally from countries as well, and not just from businesses. The main conduits for this money laundering by the Guptas and the Zoomers has been Dubai and Hong Kong. And I think the South African government is entitled to cooperation from those two jurisdictions and from China in tracking down this money and returning it. Because Dubai is the main center for collecting cash to make cash payments to bypass international anti-money laundering laws. And I say this to the banks as well. HSBC and the rest must do more, as they told me in coming to protest that I was damaging their reputation by naming them. They must do more than close old accounts and then say client confidentiality stops them doing any more. They must use their techniques of modern AI tracking technology to find that money and to follow the looters. It's not too difficult, and it's not too expensive, and it's got to be done. And auditors and consultants should be working with the government to deploy their international auditing expertise, using e-discovery, AI investigation support, lawyers with international asset seizure and recovery experience, because all of these expertise and experiences exist in the international business community. But if you're in despair, as I was, about the Zuma government's shameless looting, be comforted that for bad government, you're not alone. We in Britain have had to suffer Theresa May. And very soon we'll get Boris Johnson. Now that's something to look forward to, isn't it? And why is this all happening on the global stage? Why are the old democracies of Western Europe and the USA being turned upside down by populism, particularly from the right, but sometimes from the left? I see Brexit and Trump and Macron and Corbyn, all very different things and individuals. In the case of those leaders, very different personal values, but the same product of a revolt against political elites. That's been going on the one hand, globally. On the other hand, we've had the strongman cult. Trump, Putin, Xi, Erdogan, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil. These right-wing populists being the strong people and being concerned only to satisfy their own interests rather than the country's interests. And I think the culprit here is the kind of global economy that we've had, which has also allowed and encouraged corruption to happen in South Africa. A neoliberal economy which replaced the Keynesian post-World War combination of public investment to support private entrepreneurship and business competitiveness and success. And that's been replaced by this neoliberal economy in which 9 out of 10 people in the old democracies of the world have lost out. Yes, globalization has meant huge numbers have been lifted out of poverty globally, in China, in India, in Asia, and in many parts of the world, in Latin America and Africa as well. But a lot of people have been left behind. As I say, in the advanced industrial economies like Britain and so on, only 1 in 10 have benefited. 10% have benefited, 1% have benefited even more, and 0.1% have benefited stratospherically. That is not sustainable. That kind of inequality, widening the gap, not just between the bottom and the top, that's always happened, but between the middle and the top. If you alienate and turn the middle into discontented people, that's when you have serious problems politically and in terms of governability. And what's the solution to all of this? I think we've got to end our obsession internationally and the institutions of the world, including the World Bank and the IMF, for shrinking the state. I'm not in favor of a bloated state. I think that more state-owned enterprises in South Africa should be privatized. I don't know why so many of these enterprises are actually in the public sector at all. So I'm not in favor of a bloated, inefficient, certainly not a corrupt state, but I am in favor of an entrepreneurial, active government, active public sector, providing decent health services, providing decent universities, providing decent schools, providing support to business to innovate and grow and create jobs and prosperity. You know, you can't do it on your own as a business sector. You've got to have government, a healthy, thriving public sector. And I make this point. I've got an iPhone in my pocket. The iPhone technology was not invented by the private sector. It was invented under an American state-funded research and development grant. It took Apple to bring it to market and make it a global success. The government could never have done that, but it was actually government-funded taxpayer money that actually created the technology, and that was true for GPS and the internet and many other examples as well. You need a strong public sector, an entrepreneurial, active, efficient, thriving public sector, properly funded to support the business community. That is the lesson of the most successful modern economies. And that means paying more taxes, all of us paying more taxes. We don't like doing it, but that's the only way you can create an effective system of government. And where is South Africa in all of this? I ask because a big part of me is still in this country. A large part of my heart still beats to the South African tempo. My mother and father, South African born, were both jailed and then issued with banning orders before we were propelled into exile in 1966. They were a banning order, for those of you who are not familiar, restricted you in all sorts of ways, stopped you being politically active. One of the many clauses in it, and there were hundreds of them restricting you, was you could not communicate with another banned person. My mother was the first to be banned. My dad was banned a year later, and this presented the government with a dilemma they'd never had before. They'd never banned a married couple, so they had to give them special permission, exceptionally, to talk to each other, for which, as you can imagine, they were most grateful. So a lot of my roots are here. And I think too many, but I see South Africa from a global perspective. That's been my history, not by choice, but that's been my history. And I think you've got to think more global. It's too much parochial. Too many South Africans and too many politicians of all parties seem oblivious to the reality that this country, when you're making a wage demand or you're making some other demand of government, this country is not insulated from global competition. Every year, China produces 7.5 million new university graduates. Every year. India produces 7 million new university graduates. 2/3 of them in science and engineering and technology. South Africa produces 180,000 new university graduates. Now, you'll be right to say, but South Africa is a fraction of the size of India and China, and it is. But proportionately, South Africa is only producing half of those millions of new university graduates each year, proportionately. That's not good enough. South Africa's costs are too high, and quality and skills are too low. You're being undercut not just by these two economic superpowers of India and China that increasingly will dominate the world economy, pushing to the side the old Western democracies and economies, but by many other countries as well. And you can't afford to get behind in this global competitive race. Not just elsewhere in the world, but in Africa too. The only way you've got any chance of prospering under today's globalization is by high skills and by high investment in new technology, especially facing the fourth industrial revolution of robotics and artificial intelligence. And when you look at that challenge, I am absolutely appalled by the shocking levels of schools' performance in this country. Millions of kids are being failed by bad governance. At one time, and this may still be the case, to its great credit, the ANC government spent more on education than any other emerging nation. School attendance doubled since the dark apartheid days. In universities, 400,000 and more extra students graduated a year, and those were mostly black. That's fantastic. Yet, out of 140 countries in the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, South Africa, out of that 140, was ranked 138 for school performance, for the quality of its schools. Below desperately poor countries like Mauritania, Burundi, Benin. Frankly, colleagues, that's not just appalling, it's criminal. And it's got to stop, and it's got to be reversed. Because not only are all those kids' futures being failed, but also the country is being failed. You cannot succeed if that is happening. You've got to sort out schools. You've got to sort out, make sure teachers teach, and that the trade union doesn't act corruptly and defend bad teaching and bad administration. You've got to make sure that you do that, in my view. We've got a new president in Cyril Ramaphosa. I'm a big supporter of his. I think you're incredibly lucky to have him. By what was it, 179 votes out of 5,000 in that conference. He's got all the skills, struggle hero, trade union a negotiator, constitution negotiator, business success. There are very few candidates for president anywhere in any country in the world who've got that track record, and he's got decent values. But he can't do it on his own. And I come back to the theme I mentioned earlier. The business community, you guys, and civil society has got to take the lead in supporting the economic transformation that this country needs, because there's not been enough economic transformation, reaching right down to ordinary workers. Yes, black economic empowerment begun by Nelson Mandela and during his presidency is important. But there's a lot of unfinished business. Economic transformation's got to go down beyond board level, well into the business sector, including your own. Because if that doesn't happen, then there's going to be this increasing collision of dissatisfaction with expectations and opportunity. But without economic growth, you're simply redistributing poverty. It isn't good enough for the EFF or others, including in the ANC, to demand redistribution. You've got to have more growth. You've got to have a successful economy to accomplish that without pulling the whole economy back. And I say that my message, if anything, in what I've said this morning, is that democracy and good governance is the oxygen of economic growth and prosperity. When Neil Gopal spoke to me about what I might say to you this morning, and we discussed various issues, he mentioned that international investors are just not interested in South Africa at the moment. And I'm sure many of you will nod at that. That is because you've had 10 years of bad governance. And there's a lack of confidence. And I say to people when I bump into them in London or wherever, but South Africa is a great country with tremendous opportunity. And they talk about corruption. And what has happened in these 10 Zuma years, and it's really important, and I'm sure you know this, but I just want to reinforce it if that's the case, is South Africa has gone from hero the great hope of the world under Mandela, and the amazing transformation and the way that the country was taken forward, to zero, from hero to zero. That's the reality. And maybe you can never get back to where you were because in some sense it was an artificial bubble around that incredible leader that we had, probably the greatest leader of our times and many times in Nelson Mandela. Perhaps it was a bubble. Perhaps it was something that could never be sustained because it's unrealistic. No society's perfect in that way, not that he ever claimed to be perfect. But international investors were really keen after the dog days of apartheid when it dried up, then to say, right, we'll support the new country. And then the Zuma era just completely trashed that opportunity. And the way you get back to it is by cleaning it up together, government and business. But I think there's a huge opportunity here. I'm very optimistic about the country. You've got great infrastructure. You've got a good system of business and financial regulation, a good banking structure as well. You've got great people, you've got great energy, you've got great talent, and you've got a country that people love to visit. That must say something in itself. I think what needs to happen is you need to reclaim the Mandela legacy to make this country once again an example to the world, and I wish you all the best in that task. Thank you very much.